Okay, so I think we're ready to go. So my name is Shelley Cathcart. I am the curator of collections at the Museum of Early Trades and Crafts. And I'm just going to give you a bit of background about this presentation series that we have. It's actually in conjunction with our current exhibition, Colorado COVID, Epidemics, Pandemics, and Disease. And this explores America's experience with infectious diseases such as yellow fever, smallpox, cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis. In the exhibit, we have primary source documents, and those are supplemented with historic objects from our collection that really highlight the resources and tools and techniques physicians use to treat patients during these historic outbreaks. So hopefully you can come see us. We have this exhibition in our main gallery until June. And now I will introduce our speaker for tonight, Dr. Jude Pfister. So Dr. Pfister has been at Morristown since 2004, where he oversees the museum, archival, and library programs. He has been with the National Park Service in the field of historic preservation and cultural resource conservation since 1993. A historian by training, he has experience in a variety of settings impacting many of the nation's historic sites. His professional interests include American constitutional development and the development of American historiography as a separate discipline. He's also the author of several books, as well as multiple articles and reviews. And we are absolutely excited to have Dr. Pfister here with us tonight. And also, if you have any questions related to the presentation, please utilize the chat box function at the bottom panel of your screen. And without further ado, I will let Dr. Pfister take the floor.
Well, thank you and good evening and welcome to those joining us. I certainly want to acknowledge the Museum of Early Trades and Crafts team, Shelley Cathcart, who originally invited me to be with you this evening, and Deborah Starker, Angelica Diggs, and Jennifer Riley for arranging and facilitating this presentation. I'm going to provide a general overview to begin and of medical care in the 18th century, and in particular of the Morristown area impacting the two winter encampments here in 1777 and 1779-80. And then we'll go to some slides where we'll take a virtual tour, as it were, of the museum exhibits and pay particular attention to those galleries and exhibits impacting medical care. So tonight, my topic centers around the broad field of medicine in the era of the American Revolution. I call it broad because what exactly was medicine in 1780? Calling it medicine might even be a bit generous. Medicine in 1780 certainly was not what we consider it today. Medicine during the Revolutionary era was more likely grounded in false hope and good wishes than anything else. Medicine was still medieval, with only the faintest hints of science beginning to appear. Science and medicine in the late 18th century were only recently enjoying a collaboration that would blossom into the 19th and early 20th centuries. Casey Sepp, writing in the February 1st, 2021 edition of the New Yorker magazine, noted in a review of a biography of Elizabeth Blackwell, who was a pioneering 19th century female doctor, that medicine by 1850 had, quote, hardly advanced beyond the four bodily humors. And aside from poking, listening, peering, and taking a patient's pulse, there was no accurate way to divine what might be happening inside the body, much less why. She quotes the author of the new book as writing, quote, treatment was a matter of better out than in, trying to expel the problem with the toxic arsenal of emetics, laxatives, diuretics, and expectorants. For all the downsides to Revolutionary era medicine, there was one bright spot that was truly revolutionary: inoculation or vaccination, the introduction of a pathogen or antigen into a living organism to stimulate the production of antibodies. In America, many of the founding fathers and mothers were advocates of inoculation, including George Washington, who famously inoculated his army and some civilians in Morristown in 1777, which we will cover shortly. And I just want to reiterate again that there were 2 winter encampments in the Morristown excuse me, area, 1777, and then again in 1779-80. And I'll make sure to try and identify which one I'm talking about at any particular time. Throughout history, military leaders in general struggled to accommodate illness with little success. By the 18th century, manuals and guides were appearing by French, German, and Russian military leaders on the topic of medical care for armies. By the time of the Revolution, Congress was naturally aware of the importance of medical care. The primary issue, however, was that no one had a good sense of how to impart or understand medical care on such a large scale. This included medical doctors. There were only 3 permanent city hospitals in the colonies at the start of the war in 1775. In the early years of the war, before Washington ordered the reorganization of the medical department in 1776, the death rate in military hospitals was appalling. Hospitals were dark, dank, devoid of ventilation, devoid of compassion, hideous places conjured up in horror stories. Reading lists of drugs and potions truly seems Shakespeare's witches in Macbeth come to life. Drugs, such as they were in short supply during the war, as was nearly everything else. The number of medical degrees in the colonies in 1775 was around 200, while 3,500 practiced as doctors. I'm going to read that again. The number of medical degrees in the colonies in 1775 was around 200. So 200 people had some sort of college or university training, while there were over 3,500 people who claimed to be working as doctors. At Washington's urging, the Continental Congress provided for a hospital or medical department in 1775 when the Continental Army was created. As with much else in the American Revolutionary effort, it suffered from organizational mishaps and from a lack of overall commitment. So unruly was this initial year of the health services during the first year of the war in 1775 that Washington issued an order, as mentioned, in 1776, removing all serving doctors and ordering them replaced by qualified, certified professionals to the extent possible. Still, this did little to provide comfort to those in need of medical care. Hospitals often transmitted more disease than they cured during this time, and it is a fascinating growing field of study in its own right, much like the new book I mentioned at the outset. And there is plenty of literature available for anyone who wants to take a deeper dive into this topic. And I'll have some sources that you might want to look at when we're finished tonight. American General Anthony Wayne wrote, quote, "There is no greater or surer mark of discipline than cleanliness. So there is nothing more conducive to health and spirit. It introduces laudable pride, which is a substitute for almost every virtue." This issue of cleanliness being equated with discipline would follow the Army throughout the war and often was a matter of sanctioning troops for violating rules. Even today, those who have been in the armed forces know that cleanliness is still a treasured trait. James Tilton, Physician General of the Continental Army, wrote, quote, "Cleanliness is essential in all conditions of life, but especially to soldiers. Without the necessary cautions on this score, the Army is literally poisoned and dwindles into insignificance. Officers, therefore, should be very solicitous to protect their men as well as themselves from the dreadful effects of filth and nastiness." There is an old, accurate saying that an army travels on its stomach. This was just as true for the Continental Army during the Revolution. Following the surprising victories at Trenton and Princeton, New Jersey, over the 1776-1777 Christmas and New Year's season, Washington and the Army made an encampment in the Morristown area. One of the first obstacles Washington faced, besides smallpox, was the issue of food, an eternal problem for the Continental Army. It has been written that lack of food, poor rations, and badly prepared provisions caused malnutrition and often weakened the soldier to such an extent that he became the victim of different ailments. Diets high in meat were considered generally unhealthy. Vinegar was often mixed with rum as a purgative, and medical manuals from the time are full of remedies for purgings. Again, better out than in. And I will say, if anyone reads memoirs of Continental soldiers, you will find quite descriptive language on their attempts to purge themselves. Similarly, clothing, as is known, was in constant short supply. Stories of clothing-deprived soldiers were exceptionally common, as any school child knows. Shelter, it goes without saying, was also an important physical and emotional element of well-being for soldiers. There were all sorts of diseases, maladies, and fevers. Building huts during a winter encampment, whether it was at Morristown or Valley Forge, also carried risks. Saws, falling trees, other sharp tools made life dangerous for the soldier. Mental illness, PTSD, and we shouldn't forget things like barrel fever, which was alcoholism, and homesickness. Fever, in all of its manifestations, was the greatest killer of Army and civilians alike. And I would also point out, we should not forget women. Pregnancy was an issue as well in camps. Giving birth might not seem at first glance to belong in a discussion about Army medicine, and I can assure you, you won't find anything written about it in any medical manual from the time period. But let's not forget that women were never far from any encampment, and inevitably pregnancies would occur. And we do know that there were at least 2 documented births at Jockey Hollow during the 1779-1780 winter encampment. Dr. Benjamin Rush, one of America's foremost doctors, wrote to General Nathaniel Greene in 1778 at the end of the Valley Forge encampment. He wrote, quote, "A sure and certain method of destroying British General Howe's whole army without powder or ball or without any of the common implements of death would be to lead them through any of the villages in Lancaster country in Pennsylvania where we have a hospital, meaning a military general hospital. And I will assure you that in 6 weeks there shall not be a man of them alive or fit for duty." He's referring here to smallpox. It is, of course, a grim assessment and no doubt of tremendous seriousness. Without question, smallpox was the most feared disease of the 18th century. As early as 1720, experimental inoculations were occurring for smallpox. So by the time Washington approved it for his army in early 1777, it was not unknown. It was a process that consisted of more than administering of the smallpox itself to the patient. The patient was also put on a sparse vegetable diet and was on restricted activity for a week or more. Naturally, this was done with the greatest secrecy possible. British knowledge would likely have led to an attack of some sort. Smallpox existed in Morristown in 1777. It did not arrive with the Army. I know you might find writings or studies out there that might go against that, but there was really no smallpox in the Army or the troops that arrived. The smallpox was already in Morristown, and the Army, of course, magnified the problem tremendously. But the Army did bring dysentery, which added insult to misery. On January 20th, shortly after arriving in Morristown from the victories at Trenton and Princeton, Washington started to debate whether mass inoculation would be necessary. Washington on January 20, 1777 wrote, quote, vigorous measures must be adopted, however disagreeable and inconvenient to individuals, to remove the infected and the infection. Washington was acquainted with smallpox personally, having contracted the disease in 1751 on Barbados, where he had gone with his brother Lawrence, who suffered from tuberculosis. In what may be a hint of the now common phrase social distancing, Washington noted in his diary that after arriving on the island that he visited his host's home with great concern and did his best to keep his distance because he wrote, quote, the smallpox was in the family. Washington still caught smallpox and suffered greatly for about 6 weeks and naturally survived, or else we wouldn't be having this discussion tonight. So Washington was well aware of smallpox. So that was in January 1777. He's writing this, wondering if he should make this order to inoculate the army and the troops, by the way. Excuse me, the recruits. So 2 weeks later, on February 5th, 1777, Washington gave the order for inoculation in stages to prevent the entire army from being temporarily out of service at the same time. And as I mentioned, with what level of secrecy they could obtain. The next day, February 6, 1777, Washington wrote to William Shippen Jr., chief physician of the army in Philadelphia. This is where he writes about inoculating recruits. Washington wrote, finding the smallpox to be spreading much and fearing that no precaution can prevent it from running through the whole of our army, I have determined that the troops shall be inoculated. This expedient may be attended with some inconveniences and some disadvantages, but yet I trust in its consequences will have the most happy effects. Necessity not only authorizes, but seems to require the measure. For should the disorder infect the army in the natural way and rage with its usual virulence, we should have more to dread from it than the sword of the enemy. And I will say that Martha Washington was also inoculated, as were a number of more prominent founding fathers and mothers. Throughout the war, Washington faced 3 major outbreaks requiring mass inoculation: 1777, as mentioned, in Morristown, 1778 in Valley Forge, and 1781 in Yorktown. Now, before we go to slides, I just want to make a brief mention about, I mentioned Valley Forge. I often get asked, why is Valley Forge better known as a winter encampment than Morristown? I mean, frankly, it's sadly, but there were more deaths at Valley Forge, number one. Valley Forge had almost 2,100 deaths in 1777, 1778. Morristown had 86 over the 1779, 1780 winter encampment. One of the reasons for the disparity in deaths is that the troops were more seasoned by the time the Morristown encampment, the 79-80 encampment. There was improved sanitation. There was greater discipline. There were healthier living conditions and cleanliness, if you recall that word. And then I would also say 2 other reasons. Number one, John Marshall, the 4th Chief Justice, he was a soldier. He was in the Virginia militia. He was at Valley Forge that winter, survived, and in 1801 started to write a biography of George Washington, where he writes about Valley Forge and puts it in such a way that it starts to enter the American memory bank, if you will. And then the state of Pennsylvania turns Valley Forge into a historic site, a state historic site, in the 19th century. And so Valley Forge had a much longer run as a historic site, as a state site, before it became part of the National Park Service. And Morristown didn't become a national park site till 1933. So there was 50 years that Valley Forge was already on people's radar in terms of being a destination point. So let's move into some slides, and then we can do questions at the end. So here we are, we're talking about medical care during the hard winter. Oh, let me explain that phrase too, by the way. The hard winter. Valley Forge, by comparison, was a very mild winter from a climate standpoint. The snow, there were very few heavy storms, blizzards. It never really got as cold. Morristown, 2 years later, some of you might know by written accounts, was considered one of the worst winters in the eastern United States in hundreds of years. Harbors froze completely over. There were, I believe, over 24 recorded heavy snowstorms. So that's really why it's called the hard winter. It's not necessarily the death toll, which wasn't as high as I mentioned as Valley Forge. The hard winter refers to literally the difficult climate of the 1779-1780 winter encampment. Now, just for, I think most folks are familiar, but just in case you're not, I'm just going to show you the Museum of Early Trades and Crafts. This is their building. They are sponsoring this presentation, so thank you to them again. But this is their building in Madison, New Jersey. At Morristown, this is the visitor center at Jockey Hollow, where the main army encamped during the 1779-1780 winter encampment. This was, today it's about 1,500 acres, 1,600 acres in that vicinity, give or take. This is the visitor center where most tours would begin. People could see the Wick House, and then it's self-guided throughout the rest of the park. They can see the areas where the Pennsylvania troops were, the Maryland, New York, Connecticut. So this is where a visitor would start their tour or their visit at Jockey Hollow in the Morristown National Historical Park. Washington's headquarters that winter, 1779-1780, along with Martha. Martha was there with him. It was the Jacob Ford Jr. Mansion. Here you can see it as we like to portray it in the snow, because it was such a hard winter. But of course, that hard winter led to a beautiful spring and summer. He was there till June, so it didn't always look like this for all those 6 months. But nonetheless, I think you get the point. And then just down the hill behind the Ford Mansion is the museum building, where we're going to virtually enter the front door there and go down to the bottom level and begin our tour. Oh, I don't know how to get rid of it. Wait a minute. Guess I can minimize it, hopefully. Okay. This is a recreated hut. This is in the Discover History Center. So we have 4 main galleries in the museum building, and the Discover History Center is the it's the one that is the most user-friendly, if you will. It is very interactive. It has a lot of things for people to touch. Everybody likes to touch things in a museum, despite the signs that are placed everywhere. And so this is an area where everyone can go and touch and listen. It's got sound. It's got a lot of things that you can, a lot of interactives, both high tech and low tech. And so I wanted to show really kind of the centerpiece is this recreated hut. This would have been a typical hut that would have been at Jockey Hollow for the enlisted soldiers. And showing another view there of a mannequin in that bunk. It's, again, like I say, you can learn about some of the games that the soldiers played to keep themselves occupied. You can see a checkerboard or a chessboard there on the bottom on one of those stumps. So these huts were all uniform. I should say they were probably around 10, 11,000, well, maybe closer to 12,000 soldiers out of Jockey Hollow. So usually I think 8 to 12 soldiers per hut. They were not usually all there at any given time. They had duties, even though it was a winter encampment. They still had guard duty, marching, parade, etc. Here's another view of the exterior. You can see on that large panel there, it was called Log Hut City. In fact, when Jockey Hollow was created, I think it was the, I don't know, maybe 5th or 6th, it became temporarily the 5th or 6th largest city in the United States. Moving a little ways from that hut, you'll come to a vignette on Washington and the medical department. And here, this panel talks about what I mentioned earlier about Washington creating, pushing Congress, the Continental Congress, to create a medical department in 1775. You can see that last sentence there: poor conditions and lack of supplies compounded medical risks. If you recall, I said within a year, Washington had to completely reorganize the medical department. And then just adjacent to this panel is a vignette or a larger exhibit called, titled The Medical Department, as you can see. This is very interesting because when you get close enough to it, it has sensors. It will start to come to life. It's very Disney-esque in a certain way. That fella there will not talk to you, but the background will start to illuminate and start to present information. There are speakers above you that will start to read parts from letters, letters of the period from some of the commanders talking about how dire the medical situation was. You can see a few excerpts there, writing to His Excellency that we have upwards now of 5,000 soldiers in the hospital. The bottom one, that there are 20 men in one large room that was only designed to hold 6. Here's the kind of the front panel, which narrows down a little bit into a little to get to a smaller bit of information. James Tilton, who was the chief physician, if memory serves, he was really instrumental in designing hospitals and making them slightly more sensitive to the needs of to patients. Here you see a drawing of one of his plans for a hospital. And here's kind of a close-up. I believe they held, you can count there real quick, somewhere 25 beds. And what's interesting above it is a line drawing. And then here is an image. There was actually, this recreated hospital hut was built at Morristown at Jockey Hollow in the 1930s, 1940s, because there was a preponderance of belief, not evidence, but belief, that there was a general hospital at Morristown. But decades of research has shown that there really was no hospital, no general hospital. I should say hospitals were designated a general hospital, which was larger for long-term care. Um, there were regimental hospitals, which, as the name implies, were kind of exclusive to various regiments. And then there were flying hospitals, which were basically like a clinic or something. So this general hospital was never at Jockey Hollow. The nearest general hospital was actually in Basking Ridge, New Jersey. And but anyways, this one was removed, I believe, in the 1960s or so. But we still get visitors who, as school children, toured, especially if they're from New Jersey. They take the obligatory tour of Morristown and Jockey Hollow, and they come back 50 years later and find things changed. Some of their cherished memories are no longer there. And when you've been around as a historic site as long as we have, which is approaching 90 years, obviously history or research finds new evidence of things. And so stories do change somewhat. And it's something we deal with quite regularly. Here's just another view of the Discover History Center coming around the corner from the medical department exhibit. Now, if we move upstairs on the main gallery, there are two, the main hallway. There are two galleries on either end, one the military, the other the style gallery. Here is the panel introducing the military gallery. You can see there pretty much what I have already talked about. And then within the gallery itself, this is the vignette that really focuses on medical topics. And you can see at the top there a painting by Julian Scott of a wounded soldier with a white piece of cloth on his sword, signaling surrender because he's injured, he's in need of help. To kind of move in, you'll see this is a medical chest with various types of drugs, etc. And this is from the time period. It was used by a doctor in New Jersey, Dr. Liddell. A bloodletting instrument there in the middle. On the bottom left, number 6, are implements that were used to tap a vein. Number 4 was a tooth extractor. And then on the right, there is a saddlebag that was used by another local doctor, Dr. Campfield. Implements for surgery. Number 4 is pretty self-explanatory. Number 1 is also a saw. Number 2 is kind of a general implement that would be used to pull whatever you needed to pull out of the way while you were conducting surgery. And then number 3 is a bullet extractor. Number 5 could be used as a drill to relieve pressure in the skull. 6 is a tourniquet. And 7 are musket balls with what has come down to us in history as teeth marks from soldiers biting them. I wouldn't bet the farm on it, but nonetheless, that's what local lore tells us. Here's just another view of the military gallery from the other opposite direction. And then we'll just quickly move down to the style gallery, which is essentially the non-military side of the Revolutionary period. Just another view. And now I want to take you, oh, well, no, a moment of comic interlude. This I just saw the other day in the New Yorker. You can see a soldier there kind of midway saying, I'm beginning to suspect that he really doesn't care about us. And I put this in there. You can see the commander. I don't think it's supposed to be Washington. Maybe it's Napoleon. Maybe it's any number of commanders. He's all nice and comfortable. His horse is all nice and comfortable. And the poor common soldier dealing with the trials and tribulations of a winter in tattered clothing, etc. I think it kind of speaks volumes to what some soldiers certainly experienced, but nonetheless. Now, let's go behind the scenes. These are items that are not on exhibit. These are from our rare book gallery, rare book collection. They are not on exhibits. This is a book on domestic medicine, a treatise on the prevention and cure of diseases. You will see it's written by someone with the initials M, the title MD from the Royal College of Physicians in Edinburgh. And you can see this is the 14th edition. So it's obviously, it was a very popular title. This is a very unique document. This is from Dr. James Craig, who was Washington's personal physician. You can see in the upper left, it's dated 1799. It starts in June, and this covers 6 months. So it's basically a running tab, if you will, of medical care that Dr. Craig administered to not just Washington and Martha and the close family, but also the slaves, the enslaved people who worked in Mount Vernon itself, inside the mansion and around the mansion. And you can see a number of things on the 22nd of July. Betty, someone called Betty, was bled. There is something about a tooth. On August 17th, he set a gentleman whose name was Richmond. His thumb was out of sorts. Again, a few days later, he's back. Dr. Craig is back treating the thumb. Here's a close-up of the next page where you can see Betty. Poor Betty must have had a hard time. She's being bled about every week, it seems. You can see there on the 13th, a visit to Mrs. Washington. She had some sort of need for medical care. Right above that, Bleeding Sally. On the 21st, anodyne draught for Nate. And then right below it, a visit to check up on Nate. But here's pages 2 and 3. And what I really want to show you, and this has been written about, but this is the actual document. It's part of the Morristown National Historical Park archives. You can see there on the right-hand side, about halfway down, 22 pounds, a pence and 3 shillings, or excuse me, if I got that backwards, 3 shillings and a pence. But anyways, I want to zoom in on that NB, on that note. No charge is made by the doctor for his attendance, etc., on the general in his last illness. So this running tab started in June of 1799. For those who remember that George Washington died December of 1799, Craig would have originally sent this invoice to George for payment. Well, George wouldn't pay it, he would have given it to somebody, but nonetheless, with George Washington dead, it went to Martha. And so this is really a one-of-a-kind manuscript and document. And it's been on loan once or twice to some other museums, but we've had it on exhibit at our place once or twice as well in the time that I've been there. Harkening back to taking a patient's pulse was about all you could do, as the reporter in the New Yorker mentioned. Here you can see Dr. Craig. This is a contemporary engraving that's been hand colored. You can see Dr. Craig there looking at his watch, presumably taking Washington's pulse. You can see Martha there on the left and some medicine on the bed. This is actually, this is not a commercial, but I found this looking through a recent items for sale at an auction at Swan Galleries. So if you are so inclined, you could bid on this next month. Um, General von Steuben was truly a morale boost for the Continental Army when he arrived in the spring of 1778 at Valley Forge. He really took what was a declining Continental Army and turned it into a respectable military. And his order and discipline of the troops became exceptionally famous. It was taken and published by the Continental Congress. You can see there in March of 1779. John Jay at the time was president of the Continental Congress. And here are just a few excerpts, chapter 18, talking about necessary regulations for preserving order and, that word again, cleanliness in the camp. And one of my favorite is here we are, chapter 24, on the treatment of the sick. There is nothing which gains an officer the love of his soldiers more than his care of them under the distress of sickness. It is then that he has the power of exerting his humanity in providing them every comfortable necessary and making their situation as agreeable as possible. So think back to that New Yorker cartoon of the officer, the commander on his horse. The horse has a blanket, he has a blanket, and the other soldiers. So that officer obviously never read von Steuben's orders for troops. And so with that, I think we're going to end and move into some questions, but I just want to give you a brief list here. The website for the Morristown National Historical Park is there at the top, mps.gov/more. The Cultural Resources Curatorial Division, we have our own blog spot, which is listed there. Museum of Early Trades and Crafts, you can see metc.org. In terms of a very good introduction or basic overview of this time, I would say Gene Abrams, Revolutionary Medicine. And then if you really want to get down into this topic, the slide there has a picture of the front of the Army Medical Department, 1775 to 1818, written by Mary Gillette. It was written almost 50 years ago, but it's still, it's what everyone starts with who's going to study this topic. And you can find a PDF of that online. So with that, I thank you for your patience, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you. That was fascinating. I just typed a reminder into the chat box. So if anyone has questions, I'll give it a minute or two. You can type them right into the chat box. That button is on the bottom of your screen, and then I can go ahead and read them for our presenter tonight. So I'm going to give it one moment. Okay, so one came in so far. Were there apothecaries at this time? That's a good question.
Yes, there were. And there was an apothecary general for the Continental Army. His name was Craigie. And after the war, he lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts. His home, by coincidence, was also a George Washington headquarters site. That's where Washington spent the winter of 1775. 75, 76, and it also became the home of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, just for your fund of semi-relevant information. But yes, there were apothecaries at the time. And but again, I think the main issue with the Continental Army and with medical care was just the scale that we were talking about at that time. There was just no way to produce, let's say, even if they had drugs that did anything, there was just no way to produce them on a reliable scale, an organized scale. There was no distribution system. But Yes, the short answer to your question is yes, there were apothecaries, and the Continental Army did have an apothecary department.
Great, thank you. Did Washington require all the soldiers to be vaccinated against smallpox? It's also a good question.
He did permit some who just did not want to undergo the procedure. So it's not, again, I think most know that it wasn't like getting a shot today, of course. There was actually a knife that made a cut in a person's arm, and then smallpox pus was introduced into that cut, and usually it was sewn up, and then you had to wait about a week and a half. And so Washington did order it, but there were, of course, those who did not always follow those orders. We do know here in the Morristown area in Hanover, which is very nearby, that the residents of Hanover, when they heard what was going on in Morristown, actually got together and wrote a letter to Washington in 1777 saying, we don't want to participate in this. Sadly, Hanover suffered about a 35% death rate from smallpox, but nonetheless, people did, people did have strong views about it. And but most of the soldiers were vaccinated, yes.
Interesting question. Yeah. Another is, how about veterinarian care? Did human doctors assist? Did veterinary specialists assist MDs?
I did not come across that, no. So I would say no, but I would also hedge it by saying I don't know, because I never really came across any indication that medical doctors for humans did double duty as vets, but that's a very intriguing question.
Another is, Native Americans suffered and died from smallpox. Was this a reason given for isolating this group of people and limiting the spread of disease from the Americans?
Americans were more susceptible to smallpox than Europeans, and it's generally accepted that the British did, even as early as the French and Indian War. Remember, the American Revolution was not the first war in North America by any means. During the French and Indian War, the British were well known to have tried what we would consider germ warfare, mainly smallpox, and they did it with some success. It's kind of odd using that word, but anyways, they did have outcomes that they desired, and so during the Revolution, yes, Washington was very specific about quarantining and isolating groups, whether that be Native Americans or if he knew a particular part of Morristown or anywhere that they happened to be had an outbreak, there were guards stationed. And yes, there were quarantines or lockdowns, as we might be familiar with today, yes.
I had a question myself. Have you seen any documentation or information about, I want to use the term female nurse or practitioners, although that's not what it would have been called at the time in any of the records, involved during these encampments?
Yes. You don't come across it much. Very similar to the births. You have to either really be looking for it and kind of know your way around the sources, or you're going to stumble across it. Women, I said that women were never far from any encampment. They served a variety of roles. One of them certainly was nursing, yes, but there was, not that I'm aware of, that there was no profession. There was no profession called nursing, or let me. They didn't go to school. You couldn't. Whether even a doctor, if a doctor didn't go to a medical college, they would practice medicine very much like a lawyer would practice law, read law with an established lawyer. Doctors did the same thing. I'm not aware of nurses, certainly midwife, but in terms of a career field or job or vocation being called nursing, I did not come across that. And I really haven't come across many names either.
A follow-up question related to, I believe, smallpox previously. Was the general population inoculated? Were military given priority for inoculation?
The goal or the idea that Washington came up with was to, as I say, the plan was to do it in stages. So let's say you had 100 people, he would maybe do 25, then 2 weeks later, another 25, etc. The idea was to house these soldiers in 1777 with the general population, and then have the general population be inoculated as well. And then they would be quarantined for 2 weeks, let's say, and then hopefully everything goes well. It didn't always work that way. Washington did encounter, as I said earlier, resistance. Sometimes when soldiers were inoculated, rather than be in the relative comfort of someone's home, they were sometimes in the barns, outbuildings. But yeah, there was pushback from the general population. As I mentioned, the town of Hanover didn't want anything to do with it, and went so far as to write Washington a letter saying thanks, but no thanks. So yeah.
Another is, were there medics, and if so, were they trained?
There were medics, but again, I very much like the nursing question. I'm not aware that there was much training. They probably would have maybe learned it on kind of OJT, just on the job, by following what a doctor was doing, or maybe a doctor's assistant was doing. Again, there were 3 levels of hospitals. The general hospitals were more long-term. That's where you generally would have the better trained doctors, probably the better trained, again, I'm going to call them nurses, just use more of a contemporary term. Medics, there was not a medic corps like we think of today that I'm aware of. I think that came a little bit later, but to a certain extent, every soldier was a medic. They were required to render assistance to their comrades. They were probably, the only training they received would have just maybe been, again, very, very basic, kind of on the go kind of direction if something would have happened. So again, this was not organized in the sense that, I guess it was more organized chaos than it is organized in the sense that it is today. And I think that's, the death rates, I mean, you know, anybody again can look these things up. They're fairly well reported on, that the death rates were appallingly high, and the you know, a lot of times these soldiers, they, you know, obviously if someone's shot, okay, yeah, yeah, we know what's wrong. They got a bullet in them, but many times you just didn't know. You know, there was no diagnosis. You know, it was just very difficult to try and comprehend what was going on. And many times it was easier just to discharge somebody, even though they were a body. It might be easier just to send them to a general hospital for a month or so and then send them home. So
Similar to some other previous questions, were there herbalists since the Americans cultivated some plants?
oh, sure. Yes. That book I showed, yeah, this one. I mean, there would have been regimen and simple medicines with an appendix containing a dispensatory for the use of private practitioners. Yes, there were plenty of herbal remedies out there. I don't want to speak to the veracity of them, but that certainly was part of the toolkit that the home physician may have used, kind of the Dr. Mom sort of thing. But I think the doctors during the Revolutionary War, the ones who were serious, the ones who had maybe a medical degree like this William MD out of Edinburgh, are those who trained with doctors, would have looked more towards science, and again, admittedly science, 18th century science.
And looks like our last question tonight is, were doctors vetted?
Vetted?
Yes.
Yes, particularly after 1776, when the medical department was created in 1775. Excuse me. You know, I mentioned there were 200 credentialed doctors in the colonies at the start of the war, when 3,500 were practicing as doctors. I think when the medical department was created, they got numbers 201 to 3,500, and things did not work out. And that became apparent very quickly. So in 1776, Washington orders a complete restructuring of the medical service. And I think that's where you had more of the those 200 individuals with medical training coming more to the forefront to take leadership positions in the medical department and throughout the various ranks in the Army.
Okay, I think that answers all the questions for tonight, but if there are any follow-up ones that should come up after this evening, I'm going to put my email to everyone shortly in the chat box, and I can certainly send that along to Dr. Pfister and make sure those can get answered for you. But just want to extend a thank you tonight for being with us for a very informative presentation, on behalf of Dr. Pfister as well for tonight, for such a lot of information that was really interesting to learn about that time period. But if you want to see more programs, whether virtually, hopefully we will return to some in person soon, you can visit our website. I will also put that in the chat box for everyone as well. And we hope to see everyone soon. Thank you.
Thank you.